French is a beautiful language with a gruesome history. Think fearsome warriors, druidic magic, and gigantic ginger moustaches. And that is not the half of it. Thing is though, all this gruesomeness is what gave us the gorgeous French language in the first place. And French, well, it is nice, isn't it?
Bonhomie, bonbon, chouchou.
But don't be fooled, because there's a story to this language and it ain't always pretty. But first, let's get some facts out of the way. French is one of the 5 main Romance languages that descended from Latin, and most likely the oldest of them all. It's also noticeably different to other Romance languages. There are weird spellings, strange noises. In fact, some people think you can get away without learning any French words at all.
Oula.
French is the official language in France, obviously, but also in 29 other countries. There are over 300 million people who speak French across 5 continents, with over 50% of those French speakers in Africa. In terms of native speakers, it depends how you count dialects and Creoles, but it could be up to 110 million native French speakers. French is also the 2nd most studied foreign language in the world. And later I'm going to tell you why even English might be replaced by French. But the story of how the French language came to be is an absolute corker, and it begins a long time ago. In ancient times, there was this big region called Gaul all across Western Europe, and this is where the French story begins. If Gaul sounds familiar, maybe you recognise this little guy. Asterix the Gaul is more than just a famous comic character. He's a cultural icon in France, and with good reason. He represents the time of the very beginnings of the French language, and French has seen quite an evolution. The Gauls spoke Gaulish, which was a Celtic language, or really a bunch of Celtic dialects. The closest we still have to these languages are Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. That's right, Cornish. Then along came Julius Caesar in 58 BC, in the mood for a fight.
These Gauls will make Latin a dead language, if Julius Caesar would insist on fighting them.
Unfortunately for the real Gauls, they had no magic potion to make them invincible, and the Romans did what Romans do. Charming.
We who are about to die, salute you!
Caesar never forced the Gauls to speak Latin, but speaking Latin helped their social standing and even helped them get jobs with the Romans. Fun fact, this is also where the term Romance language comes from, to speak like a Roman. You didn't think it meant romantic, did you? So it's no wonder many people were eventually bilingual. Gaulish was able to coexist alongside Latin for centuries under Roman rule. It even played a role in shaping the Vulgar Latin dialects that developed into French. So the Gauls hung on to the Gaulish language, especially for their private rituals and magical practices. That's right, speak Gaulish and you could put a spell on your enemy. The trick was not to translate it into Latin, or it wouldn't work. This is an ancient curse tablet found in France. A curse would be scratched into thin sheets of lead, and this one was put inside a woman's grave so she could keep cursing those Romans even after she died. But this is actually one of the most important inscriptions in the Gaulish language, and it gave us a rare insight into the grammar of the language. Sadly, we don't really have much Gaulish writing to examine because the Druids didn't allow you to keep written records. And let's face it, who's going to argue with powerful Druids with a penchant for human sacrifice? So most of the language remains shrouded in the past. But not all. You know how French people count things in 20s? 80 is 80, 420s, and 90 is 90, 420s, and a 10. Well, that is how the Gauls used to count. And if you want a bit more material to impress people at your next dinner party, here are Gaulish words that made it into modern French. And there are also a few other clues that the influence of the Gauls has not entirely disappeared. Here's an example of how words might have evolved through those languages over the generations. Take the word horse. Well, here is how it evolves from classical Latin to Gaulish to Vulgar Latin and eventually ending up as modern French. You can't have French without everything that came before it. And if you think that's interesting, then why not subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more videos like this on the way. Okay, so at this stage, we have an early Gallo-Roman language that is Gaulish, existing alongside Latin. And then the Franks came to town. In the 5th century AD, the Franks, who were the Germanic tribes from the Northern Sea, invaded Gaul. The Romans called them barbarians, and they were even better at plundering than other tribes that had attacked before, such as the Vandals and the Visigoths. The Frankish language that they spoke had a profound influence on the Vulgar Latin spoke by the Gauls. Vulgar Latin picked up the Frankish stress patterns, which kind of explains why French is a bit different from other Latin-derived languages like Spanish, which you can hear in words like bouquin. Can you hear the stress at the beginning of that word? It's also why French lost its final vowels, while languages like Italian still have them. In fact, most modern French words of Germanic origin came from Frankish. But although modern French inherited hundreds of Celtic and Germanic origin words, the structure of the French language and the greater part of its vocabulary are all thanks to Latin. So let's see what we have now. We have the Gauls, the Romans, and the Franks. Quite the multicultural society. And this gave us 3 language roots for French. We've got Celtic, Latin, and Germanic. As you can imagine, there was also a world of mini dialects going on within that. So which of them made it through to the modern language? Well, the old dialects eventually grew into distinct separate languages. The southern dialects were known as the Langue d'Oc, which became Occitan. The northern dialects became Old French, known as the Langue d'Oil, and that gives us... One of these old French dialects was spoken in the region of Paris. This dialect was called Francien, and this is the variety that would eventually become modern French. Back then, it was only spoken by the elite, and they pronounced it François, not Francien. And of course, now we say Français. The other dialects became, well, the other languages that now exist in France today, which is quite interesting, right? But what about Latin? What happened to Latin during this whole period? Well, nothing. It continued to be used for a very long time. The educated upper class used Latin for writing and all their other important affairs. Okay, so we are in the 5th century AD and the Franks are now in control. They are all powerful. Would anyone dare to fight them? Well, yes, someone did, and I'll tell you who that is in just a second. But you see, it's stories like this of how language and people evolve that I find so fascinating. But what a lot of people don't realize is that you can actually use stories to actually learn a foreign language, like French or any other language. Stories are great because they make everything more interesting, and stories make the language easier to remember too. This is why I teach languages through stories myself. And if you'd like to try this out, I've actually prepared a short story in French that's designed to help you learn French. The short story is completely free, and there's a link to it in the description if you'd like to download it. You'll get the story itself along with some helpful tips for how to learn French through stories, which is really useful if you're looking for a more natural way to learn French. Anyway, who was it who dared to attack those 5th century Franks?
Charge!
You guessed it, of course they attacked France. They're Vikings. In 845 AD, the Vikings invaded and seized Paris with 120 Viking ships, led by this guy. Or was it this guy? The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, who was actually rather hairy. He paid them £7,000 of silver and gold to leave. And leave they did, until they came back again 12 times for more silver and gold. I'm pretty sure there's a lesson in there about the folly of negotiating with terrorists. And as it always goes, many Vikings ended up settling there, mixing with everybody else, and eventually becoming who we know now as the Normans. Their language was Old Norse, a Scandinavian language, and that too left a mark on the French vocabulary. But still, French was evolving. Do you want to hear some Middle French from the 16th century? Of course you do.
Moi étant prisonnière aux soldats de Babylone.
After the 14th century, there were dramatic changes to French. For one, it picked up a lot of Italian vocabulary, especially military, architectural, and literary words, and became clearly distinguished from the other northern French dialects. By the 16th century, French had finally replaced Latin as the administrative language of France. A bunch of officials signed an edict, and that was that. No more Latin. From then on, standard French began to replace local dialects. And at long last,
Bonjour.
modern French began properly in the 17th century. It quickly became the lingua franca of Europe. The first French grammar books were printed. It was decided that French had to be kept pure, and they came up with an academy, especially to protect the French language. More on that strange situation later. By the 18th century, French was being used internationally as the language of diplomacy, even though most ordinary folk in France were still speaking the various northern dialects, all the way up to 1881, in fact. What happened in 1881? Well, they passed these laws known as the Jules Ferry laws, making it pretty hard for anyone to resist learning French any longer. See, they made French education in French not only compulsory, but also free. And languages outside of French were actually banned from primary schools. So it didn't take long before even the more rural areas of France quickly started adopting French as their main language. Another thing that started to take shape in the early 1700s was the Enlightenment, of course. Big thinkers were trying to create a society based on reason, logic, and merit. And with France being the leading land power in Europe, French, the language, soon became the lingua franca. Even the monarchs of Russia and Prussia spoke and wrote in excellent French. Russian, German, and Scandinavian courts spoke French. Canadians had a reputation for speaking French, as well as the Parisians did. So what does modern French actually look like as a language? Well, as anyone who's tried to learn French will know, Pronunciation and spelling and the link between the two are usually the first things that strike you as being rather hard. All those silent letters for one thing. And we can blame Old French squarely for this. The spelling hasn't changed much since those times, but the pronunciation has. So where silent letters used to be pronounced in Old French, now they're not. And this is why it's so confusing. French also has gender, which means you have to do the usual juggling act with articles, pronouns, adjectives. But there is good news too. French sentence structure goes subject, verb, object, just like English, at least for simple sentences. There are also many loanwords and cognates with English as well, which is that handy Germanic influence coming through to help you out, although not everyone is thrilled about this. A little over 100 years ago, the government launched an aggressive campaign to purge anything that was not standard French from the language. It's called l'Académie Française, and their job is to protect the beautiful French language from that bad foreign influence, like English words in particular. The Academy consists of 40 members. They have a uniform, a sword, the whole shebang. These guys are the sole authority on French usage, and the whole thing is pretty controversial, even among French people. In 1990, they made changes to about 2,400 words, and then in 2016, they made more spelling reforms. For example, some words lost their circumflex accents, the ones with the little hat. And because we're in the 21st century now, it was Twitter that went crazy this time, not the Vikings. There was a massive backlash and people were absolutely fuming. French speakers started tweeting with extra accents or adding their own simplifications to the simplifications. Lots of very strong feelings there. And if you're watching this and you are French, let me know what you think about the Academy in the comments.
Ah la vache.
But spelling aside, it's the pronunciation where most learners of French would be glad of some simplification.
Bouilloire, serrurerie, préférerait, écureuil, inébranlablement, fourrure.
And then there are some glorious expressions that we most definitely want to keep.
Ah la vache. Devenir chèvre, arrête ton char.
Now in the modern world, it's really important to realise that French is no longer just the domain of France. And indeed there's a tendency in the teaching and language and publishing world to treat French as purely the language of France, which of course it isn't. And this is a big deal for our friends around the world who speak French as a native language, but might never have even been to France. In Canada, you've got a variety of French that's full of interesting words derived from First Nations languages.
Ben non, nous autres aussi, on est des touristes, je sais que vous venez, tu sais.
You've also got French that travelled out of Canada.
Bonjour, mon nom c'est Sam Craft, on est ici à la Nouvelle-Orléans.
Have you heard that twang? It is Louisiana French. And you may not know that there were 1 million French speakers in Louisiana in the 1960s, because Louisiana was colonized by French Canadians, you see. In Switzerland, people speak Romandie French. And then you've got the Creoles, spoken in islands like Martinique and Haiti. But Africa wins hands down with 31 francophone countries. And if you watch this video, you'll find out why I think African French might end up replacing English as the lingua franca of the world. Really.